Hello. So this is our assessment report. I'm Alyssa, and I'm going to be presenting with Carol, Cass, and Lauren. So some of our client's background information. He is a 12-year-old male. His primary language at school and at home is English. He currently lives with his biological parents and older siblings. He is in the 5th grade, and he is currently in a general education classroom at an elementary school. And he also receives RSP services and speech services. So our client is being assessed to determine his educational setting. So we use informal and formal assessments to assess all areas of his language. The informal assessments we used were observation to assess his pragmatics and functional communication, as well as conversation to assess his pragmatics and functional communication. We also took a language sample to assess articulation, voice, and fluency. We used an oroperipheral examination to assess his motor structures and their function. And we also reviewed his records to review his treatment history and any diagnoses that are relevant. And he was formally assessed in his school speech therapy room in English. And the tests we administered were the receptive one-word picture vocabulary test and the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test to assess his receptive and expressive vocabulary and make sure that they're age appropriate. And we also administered the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, 5th edition, or the SLP 5, to assess morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So for the results of his informal assessment, for pragmatics, he was determined to use appropriate body posture, eye gaze, and use of gestures. He was able to monitor his communication partner's level of interest and adjust accordingly. He demonstrated appropriate use of turn taking and responded relevantly to the conversation. During observation, he was observed to listen actively to his communication partners, whether peer or adult, and he also responded appropriately and respectfully to all of his communication partners. For his voice, he did not demonstrate any disfluencies. He had adequate volume, prosody, and pitch, and he was fully intelligible. For his OPE, he didn't have any physical abnormalities, and he demonstrated functional use of his jaw, lips, teeth, and tongue. And during his articulation, he did not display any articulatory errors.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about receptive and expressive language pertaining to semantics. So the tests that were used were the formal assessments of the ROWPVT4 and the EOWPVT4. Both tests measure appropriate vocabulary, and the ROWPVT assesses receptive vocabulary by asking the student to point to the correct picture from a field of 4 images when describing an object, action, or concept. And the EOWPVT assesses expressive vocabulary by testing the client's ability in naming objects, actions, and concepts from a field of 4 images. If you look at the percentiles in both scores, they're very low. For the ROWPVT, it's the 7th percentile, and the expressive test, it's the 10th percentile. The standard score of the ROWPVT was 78, implicating the client's receptive vocabulary skill development is below average, and the client standard score of 81 in the EOWPVT also reflects a below average expressive vocabulary skill development. And during the EOWPVT, the client made some consonant confusions when producing the target, but these confusions were not significant enough to be scored against him. And other errors made by the client were semantically related errors. For example, he would say stinks for skunk. However, the client also produced errors that were not related semantically, such as saying cow for pineapple. And the client was also observed to make comments such as, it was just in my head, or it's on the tip of my tongue. You can also see there's a 4-point difference between the receptive and expressive scores, but this is within normal limits. Next slide.
Okay, so the next test that the client took was the SELF-5, which is testing, it's a norm reference test, and it's used to assess morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. And it has 8 subtests, but we used 5 because they were specifically used to assess the client's semantic skills. And there's a few more that we used for syntax, but that'll be on the next slide. So the first subtest that was used to test his semantic abilities was word classes. And this subtest assesses his ability to categorize words based on their semantic relationships with one another. And the student received a scaled score of 7 and a standard score of 85 on this subtest. And these scores fall within 2 standard deviations below the mean, which are listed as low average. The following directions subtest, this one required him to understand and follow verbal directions that were given to him. And these directions started small and then increased in their length and complexity throughout the test. And he received a scaled score of 6 and a standard score of 80, as you can see, and those also fall within 2 standard deviations under the mean and are considered low average. The understanding spoken paragraphs subtest was given to him, and this, excuse me, the purpose of this subtest was to test the client's ability to comprehend verbal narratives, to maintain attention, to answer questions about something that was read to him, and to predict and infer information about the narrative that was read to him. The client scored a scaled score of 5 and a standard score of 75 on this subtest, and these are also considered low scores. The word definition subtest, this one analyzes his ability to describe, or his description skills, and his ability to describe the meaning of given words. The client received a scaled score of 7 and a standard score of 85, which are considered low average as they fall within 2 standard deviations below the mean. And lastly, the semantic relationship subtest, he received a scaled score of 6 and a standard score of 80. The purpose of this subtest was to test his ability to explain temporal relationships, to use a passive voice, to compare items to one another, to identify direction and location of objects, and to explain the meaning of sentences, and finally to utilize serial order. And since these scores also fall within 2 standard deviations below the mean, they are considered low average.
The formal assessment used to examine the client's receptive and expressive syntactic abilities was the SELF-5. As previously mentioned, the SELF-5 has subtests that assess receptive and expressive language. These subtests are formulated sentences, recalling sentences, and sentence assembly. The formulated sentences subtest assesses the client's ability to create grammatically and semantically correct spoken sentences. This measures expressive language capabilities in the area of syntax. The client received a scaled score of 5 and a standard score of 75. These are considered to be low scores on the interpretation evaluation results. The recalling sentences subtest assesses the client's ability to recall and repeat sentences of increasing length and syntactic complexity. The client received a scaled score of 6 and a standard score of 80. These scores are considered low scores on the interpretation evaluation results. The sentence assembly subtest assesses the client's ability to produce grammatically acceptable syntactic structures, and the client is to formulate 2 grammatically correct sentences from words and phrases that are visually and verbally provided. The clients received a scaled score of 80 and a standard score of 90. These scores are considered average scores on the interpretation evaluation results. So through formal and informal assessments, it's been made evident that the client has deficits in his receptive and expressive language in the area of syntax, as well as semantics. The client did really well in pragmatics, articulation, voice, and fluency, and his weakness in semantics and syntax directly affects his structural linguistic knowledge, working memory, and metalinguistic skills. So these deficits make it difficult for the client to create meaning and learn from instruction. So the client will have difficulty creating knowledge from given information due to his deficits in expressive and receptive language in the areas of syntax and semantics. With the information presented after the assessment, it's important to address the client's structural linguistic knowledge, working memory, and metalinguistic skills in therapy to address his weaknesses in receptive and expressive language in regards to syntax and semantics. The deficits in expressive and receptive language will negatively affect the client because this will interfere with his communication, draw adverse attention, and negatively impact his performance in school.
Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the SMART goals. So SMART goal number 1 is by November 1st, 2016, the student will identify the correct image that corresponds to a spoken word, phrase, or sentence in a visual field of 4, 8 out of 10 times independently across 3 consecutive sessions as measured by data collection. Objective 1 states by February 1st, 2016, the student will identify the correct image that corresponds to a spoken word in a visual field of 4. 8 out of 10 times with minimal prompting across 3 consecutive sessions. Objective 2 and 3 are the same, except that objective 2, instead of the word level, it works on the phrase level. And then objective 3, instead of the phrase level, it works at the sentence level. And this goal was written with the purpose of improving the client's receptive language. We noted that the client did not do well in the formulated sentence subtest of the SELF-5. His score was 75, which was considered low on the interpretation of evaluation results. And that's why we did a goal that reflects what happened, like how that reflects that subtest. Next slide. So SMART Goal 2 is by November 1st, 2016, the student will create 5 syntactically correct sentences when given a wordless picture book with 80% accuracy independently across 3 consecutive sessions as measured by data collection. Objective 1 says by February 1st, 2016, the student will create 5 syntactically correct sentences when given a wordless picture book with 80% accuracy, given maximal prompting, across 3 consecutive sessions as measured by data collection. Objective 2 and 3 are the same, except that in objective 2, instead of maximal prompting, we're going to limit it to moderate prompting. And in objective 3, we're going to limit the prompting to minimal prompting instead of moderate prompting. And this goal is a syntax goal to address expressive language. It will provide practice for the student with producing syntactically correct sentences, and using a wordless picture book, the student will have to create sentences independently. Next goal. So goal number 3 is by November 1st, 2016, the student will recall 4 details from a story after being read a short narrative with 100% accuracy, given no prompting or cueing across 3 consecutive sessions as measured by data collection. Objective 1 states that by February 1st, 2016, the student will recall 4 details from a story after being read a short narrative with 25% accuracy, given no prompting or cueing across 3 consecutive sessions as measured by data collection. Objectives 2 and 3 are the same, but the accuracy will change from 25 to 50 and 50 to 75. And this last goal was written with the intention of improving the client's working memory, because that is also an area that he struggled in, that we noted from the tests. Next slide.
Okay, so now I'm going to go over the data sheets that we created for this assignment. We focused on goals 1 and 2 for the activities to make the data sheet. One of them is binary and one of them is multidimensional. So the first one is for goal 1, and it is a binary data sheet. If you recall, the goal required the student to focus on identifying the correct image that corresponds to a spoken word, phrase, or sentence. And in each objective, it went from word to phrase to sentence. And so depending on which objective the clinician is working on with the student, they can indicate in the box, you can see W, P, and S, which level they are focusing on. There's 10 trials because we want them to get it correct 8 out of 10 times independently by the end of all of their objectives. That is their goal. And then of course, plus or minus, if they got it right or wrong, they can indicate that in the boxes, and then there is a space for notes. And then our second data sheet is for SMART Goal 2, which stated that the student will create 5 syntactically correct sentences when given a wordless picture book with 80% accuracy. And so we have 5 trials because we want them to create 5 sentences. We did our multidimensional data a little bit differently. So the student will receive a score of 5 if they are able to correctly produce a sentence independently. But for each prompt that he needs, we will reduce the score by 1 point. So finally at 0, that's if they needed 5 or more prompts, and or if they were just unable to produce the sentence at all. And then of course there is a space for notes. That is our presentation. Here are our sources, and thank you for listening.